Well, joining me now from Medford, Massachusetts is Sung-Yoon Lee. He's a professor of Korean studies at Tufts University. In Augusta, Georgia, we have Han Park. He's the founding director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is former CIA analyst Bruce Klingner. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Sung-Yoon Lee, let me start with you. Professor Lee, you've almost seen this movie before, I think. There's been a lot of drama, a lot of pageantry in Pyongyang right now. Is there substance behind it? Should we be hopeful?
Well, Kim Jong Un has all the reasons in the world to be very hopeful because things are progressing swimmingly for Kim with this Inter-Korean summit, the third in less than 5 months. Kim can further beautify, normalize his menacing image, come to be accepted as a legitimate global statesman presiding over a not so abnormal nation. And that's in his long-term strategic interest because now the momentum will further shift toward more talks, more open-ended, never-ending negotiation process with which Kim will be able to buy more time and money with which to further advance his nuclear capabilities. So I think this Inter-Korean summit, it's lost the glamour, the luster of the first summit back in April, but it is a meaningful event for Kim Jong Un especially. And for the South Korean visitor, there is a convergence of interests between the two Korean leaders. President Moon of South Korea wants a peace declaration leading to a peace treaty, which would favor North Korea in that such events, such a series of events, would call into question the very raison d'etre of U.S. troops stationed in South Korea, would probably create the conditions, calls by the South Koreans, North Koreans, and probably Americans eventually to withdraw U.S. troops from the South once North Korea and the United States conclude a peace treaty. So all this favors, in the long term, a shift in the balance of power for North Korea.
Okay, so skeptical tone there. Bruce, do you agree that this is beautifying and normalizing what is menacing and abnormal? It's a bad idea, according to Sung-Yoon Lee. Do you agree with it?
Well, a summit meeting can either be successful or yet another beautification of Kim Jong Un. President Moon really has a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. He's gone very far down the path of improving relations with North Korea, providing a long list of promises of yet more economic largesse to North Korea, yet he hasn't really been carrying the ball on the denuclearization. He sees that, and other South Korean officials have said they see that as a bilateral U.S.-North Korean issue. They just want to be the good cop of offering a lot of benefits. So President Moon, though, does have to get a firmer commitment from North Korea, more specifically as to unilaterally disarming its nuclear arsenal as required by 11 UN resolutions.
Han Park, is Moon Jae-in being played? Is he being naive, and is this all going to just benefit Kim Jong Un, who has to make very few concessions?
South Korea and Moon Jae-in too, they have no place here because everything hinges on, regarding denuclearization, it is between the United States and North Korea. Even ending the Korean War, South Korea has no legal spot there. So South Korea is simply an mediator, facilitator, as opposed to a provider of security or peace. So it is so important that we realize the limit of South Korean authority and power. And we have to involve eventually, hopefully sooner, the United States so that tangible and realistic improvement can be worked out between the United States and North Korea.
That's an interesting point. Sung-Yoon Lee, I know you and Han Park don't agree on much, but would you agree with the fact that rather than the United States being a mediator between the two Koreas, in reality, it's more like South Korea is actually the mediator between the United States and Pyongyang?
I think mediator is the wrong moniker because that implies a neutral role between two adversaries. But to South Korea, the United States is South Korea's sole ally. So for the South Koreans, and they do say it, to come out and say that they're playing the role of the mediator is a bit problematic. South Korea's role here is actually quite important because South Korea is well positioned and certainly has the intention to return to the kind of very generous engagement policy we've seen before between 1998 and 2008. In particular, President Moon's former boss, the late President Roh Moo-hyun, when he was in power between 2003 and 2008, gave North Korea, on the record, $900 million worth of goods, most of that in cash, for 5 years. That is a very agreeable arrangement if you are the Kim regime. And of course, President Moon came with South Korea's wealthiest people, the owners, de facto owners of these chaebol, the conglomerates, head of Samsung, SK, LG, and so on. And that, of course, implies, more than implies, that South Korea is just itching to give, to invest in North Korea, and that works in Kim's favor as well.
Han Park, do you believe that the North has managed to drive a wedge between South Korea and the US over the past few months?
No, I think that if you look at from purely security point of view, that observation is valid. But now North Korea doesn't want security. It wants peace because it wants economic development more than anything else. Would like to end the Korean War. Instead of having another security arrangement, it wants peace agreement. So that requires the participation of the United States, and everything now hinges on American gestures.
Professor Lee, does North Korea want peace?
When we talk about peace, what are we talking about? We have had no war. There has been no war in or around the Korean Peninsula since the signing of the armistice in 1953, whereas if you look at the period, 60-year period leading up to the outbreak of the war in 1950, I count 5 major wars in and around the Korean Peninsula. What does that mean? It has long-term implications. Simply, South Korea has grown very successful, very rich, and that means that the South Korean government and the public, understandably, have no stomach to raise tension, to escalate tension with North Korea. So when North Korea says we want peace, we want to end the war, North Korea has some other objectives in mind, namely dismantling the UN command, dismantling the Combined Forces Command, the alliance between the US and South Korea, and eventually evicting US troops from South Korea so that North Korea would be better positioned to censor, bully, emasculate South Korea.
Okay, Bruce, I'm going to come to you in a minute. I'm not ignoring you, but I want to get Han Park's response to this. Han Park, they only want peace on their terms, right? And those terms aren't acceptable to the vast bulk of the international community.
I mean, they may want security on their own terms, but peace doesn't have any ownership. We have to make sure that peace is not the absence of war. If you define that way, there would be no peace. Peace is accommodation of differences as expressed in June 15th agreement between the two sides, and America certainly went along with that. So we have to look at accommodating differences, and even North Korea is a different system. We should accept the way it is rather than trying to make it the way we would like to see it unrealistically.
Right.
So the difference between peace and security is so vital in understanding present climate here.
Bruce, we've had 3 months since that Singapore summit. Enough time to take a step back and try to look at the U.S. role and what it means with regards to North Korea. What is the U.S. role right now?
Well, the U.S. is trying, as it has in 8 previous international agreements with North Korea, which all failed, and through 11 UN resolutions, is trying to get North Korea to denuclearize. In the UN resolutions, there's no requirement to provide benefits to North Korea. The international community, not just the United States, requires that North Korea abandon not only its nuclear, but also its missile and biological and chemical warfare programs in a complete, verifiable, irreversible manner. So that is what is required by the UN of North Korea. So as for peace, one would think of, well, who has been the one that's violated the peace since 1950? That has been repeatedly North Korea. They've invaded the South. They've committed countless acts of terror, acts of war, acts of aggression, numerous threats, etc. So it's the U.S. and South Korea which should be asking for declarations of non-hostile intent by North Korea, not the other way around, as Pyongyang repeatedly does.
Han Park, have the violations been as one-sided as Bruce puts it?
No, I think both sides. The United States in 1994, that agreement in Geneva, the United States has been unable, for domestic reasons, unable to carry out its obligation. So that was the beginning of deterioration with respect to denuclearization. So it is so important now. South Korea, we have a new regime. In America, we have entirely different kind of foreign policy postures by this president. He may be unable to carry out his ideas, but we are looking at new reality domestically as well as internationally. We should pursue more positively, accept North Korea the way it is, and as the South Korea is trying to do. So everything hinges on the United States policy.
Sung-Yoon Lee, on a scale of 0 to 100 as things stand, what are the possibilities that in the near future we'll have denuclearization of North Korea?
I would say about minus 100, about as high as the probability of, through artful diplomacy, persuading any of the other 8 nuclear weapons possessing states to give it up. The United States, China, Russia, France, Britain, India, Pakistan, and Israel. But when it comes to tiny, backward North Korea, which is aid-dependent, one still harbors that illusion. Maybe if we are generous, patient, civil, and give them what they want, maybe for the right price, they'll give it up. But I would say exactly for the same reasons, because North Korea has little else except for military power and has to contend with a far more prosperous, pleasant, legitimate Korean state across the border, which is a magnet to North Korea's own people. You have a problem, you don't give up your nuclear capabilities.
So are we all just wasting our time then if, as you say, nobody will actually give up their nukes willingly, especially not North Korea, especially when it's the only thing that they have? So would any kind of long-term peace deal mean that you have to accept that they have nukes and they're going to keep them?
So can we learn to live with a nuclear North Korea, assume that it will behave like a conventional nuclear weapons state, not threatening nuclear annihilation every now and then? Maybe, but maybe not. Why? Because of the basic internal dynamic in the Korean peninsula. North Korea has to live with a far more successful, attractive Korean state. So for North Korea to be resigned perpetually to be the inferior Korean state, that is a very gloomy long-term prospect. And I don't think Kim Jong Un, who's only in his mid-30s, can live with that kind of gloomy future.
Bruce?
We all need to wake up to the reality that North Korea is already a nuclear state, nuclear-capable state. So that's the only reason they are denuclearizing, agree to denuclearization. They will never give up completely nuclear capability, without which they cannot ensure security.
Right, right. Han Park saying that's the reality. Bruce?
If we accept North Korea as a nuclear state, we've undermined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We've undermined 11 UN Security Council resolutions. We send a dangerous signal to other nuclear aspirants like Iran and others. And a peace declaration or a peace treaty has a number of ramifications, all negative, as Professor Lee pointed out. It sets in motion this feeling that if the war is over, why does South Korea and the U.S. have such a strong deterrent against additional North Korean attacks? What you have a peace treaty should require is conventional force reduction, such as we had in the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, where we reduce the conventional threat by North Korea to the Republic of Korea but not before that. You need to have reductions before you have this declaration, which could set in train reductions of the Allied deterrence.
Han Park, are you convinced by any of that?
Yes, yes. The fact that North Korea, Kim Jong Un wants economic development is a reality, and the extent of their desire is extremely high. So we should mobilize this, manipulate this, give what they want. And that is peace and replacing the armistice agreement with a permanent peace arrangement. That's what we should give. Otherwise, North Korea as a nuclear state is much more a realistic threat to the danger of the world and the region.
And as you say, Han Park, you keep on mentioning that the United States is the key actor here. If there are Chinese viewers watching this segment, wouldn't some of them be thinking, hey, what about us? Aren't we the biggest influencer when it comes to the behavior of North Korea?
Yes, for Korean Peninsula's peace, we've got to include China. China is one of the signatories of the armistice agreement currently we have. Any kind of peace agreement should involve China. So Chinese role is important. Chinese real contribution to the Korean peace is there. It has the ability, it has the willingness.
Sung-Yoon Lee, is what the Chinese want and the United States wants, is that the same thing?
Not really. The U.S. is quite far from the Korean Peninsula, as we know, has no real territorial geostrategic aspirations except for protecting U.S. interests in the region in concert with Japan, whereas China for hundreds of years, 2,000 years at least, has enjoyed great sway over the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is China's sole treaty ally and vice versa. And that means China is not really perturbed about a tiny North Korean state armed with a few nuclear weapons right next to China. That causes problems from time to time, but at the same time is also very useful as a card to play against China's biggest adversary over the long term, which is, of course, the United States. So states have different national interests, and that's the way things are. And the way to get China on board from the U.S. perspective is not to resort to exhortation, do the right thing, you're a responsible stakeholder, and so forth, using moral suasion, but put some, financial hurt on Chinese state-owned enterprises and big banks that go on blatantly violating UN Security Council resolutions and U.S. sanctions legislations on North Korea, doing money laundering services for North Korea, aiding North Korea's proliferation, and so on, and see what kind of ripple effect that might have on other would-be violators. The U.S. has not tried that ever.
Should they try it, Han Park? Would you accept that?
I think North Korea needs China 100 times more than it needing the United States. China has provided food and other aid because they border there. So that without China, North Korea would not have survived physically, food supply and everything. So North Korea is realistically very keen to the reality, and North Korea will never ignore and make its relations with North Korea insignificant. So it's there, but they can live without the United States, but they cannot live without China.
Okay, let's see what happens after the Pyongyang summit. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you once more on the Newsmakers, Sung-Yoon Lee, Bruce Klingner, and Han Park.